Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank the conference organizers for including this paper in the agenda. I'd like to thank Mike and Craig for providing their feedback as well as to all of you for providing your collective thoughts on our paper. Presenting this paper here at the St. Louis Fed is incredibly special to me because the St. Louis Fed was my first employer out of college. I am an alum, proud alum of the St. Louis Fed. And while I was doing my PhD at Washington University in St. Louis, I bugged Jim Fuchs successfully to allow me to come back and hang around with the examiners. And that partnership has continued even while I moved to Bloomington. And this paper is a byproduct of being able to talk to examiners as well as to academics on research questions that may have been of mutual interest to both the regulatory and to the academic community. That specific research question is how does reliance on third parties, in this case it's going to be auditors, affect regulatory actions or the behavior of bank examiners? Alternatively stated, what we're after here is, do examiners actually work harder when they can no longer rely on outside information? And this question, we believe, is particularly important due to some regulatory changes that have recently occurred. So a prominent rule that was implemented in Dodd-Frank is that regulators and examiners were told to de-emphasize the role of credit ratings in assigning risk weights or assigning to determining credit risk for certain securities on banks' balance sheets. And this trade-off that might occur as to whether or not reliance on third parties or external sources of information in bank supervision is not necessarily clear. Basel and FIDICIA have all codified in various forms the use of external information in helping bank examiners assess bank risk. And in that sense, reliance on third parties could be thought of as a positive. But at the same time, as you increase reliance on third parties, it allows for incentives from the bank examiners to just check the box or to step back and just take at face value what the auditors or the credit rating agencies are telling them, without substantively testing the underlying economics of the securities that they're trying to assess. Before the fact, which economic force is actually going to win out in the data is not really clear, and we're going to take this trade-off to the data to see which actually wins out. So we all know a little bit about the institutional background, but let me tell you the setting that we're looking at. We're looking at banks that are externally governed by two forces. We have the auditors, and we have the bank examiners. And a lot has been written about the disparate incentives that both of these parties have. On the one hand, the examiners are focused on ensuring the safety and soundness of the institution. And on the other hand, the auditors are focused on producing a clean financial statement for the bank that they can take and produce to their external stakeholders. But beyond these disparate incentives, they actually perform some similar tasks. For instance, the examiners are interested in finding the effectiveness of the internal control or the financial reporting of the bank. And at the same time, certain banks are required to get an external audit from an audit firm that attests to the effectiveness of the internal control over financial reporting. We surmise that this overlap of function may allow examiners to just take the product that the auditors produce, thereby creating this reliance. And we're going to exploit a setting in which auditors no longer perform this task, but examiners still must perform this task. And the specific setting we're going to look at is this 2005 change to FIDICIA. This change to FIDICIA affected banks between $500 million and $1 billion, and these affected banks no longer had to get a mandated external internal control over financial reporting audit. And we're going to compare the actions of those examiners of those affected banks relative to the unaffected group, those banks below that threshold. Graphically, this is what we're going to do. So Tom, this is dedicated for you. We have the beautiful state of Indiana here, and we have a hypothetical bank in our sample, a $400 million bank in South Bend. This is what we would deem as a control bank. We also have a treated bank here, or an affected bank, a hypothetical $700 million bank in Carmel, Indiana. We're going to employ some econometric techniques that allow us to circumvent some concerns that you all might have, given that there's a crisis looming in the background. Specifically, we're going to include bank-level fixed effects, which allow us to control for just time-invariant differences in the fact that one bank might be rural, the other might be urban. One bank might have great management, the other might have poor management. One bank might have great loan officers, and the other one might have really poor loan officers. We're also going to isolate our effects to within the same state at the same time. What this lets us do is compare these banks within the same state, thereby not contaminating our results by looking at an Indiana bank versus a Michigan bank, or an Indiana bank versus a California bank. It also lets us isolate the effect of our results to within the same time. So we're not comparing 2009 to 2005. So what we find is that after examiners can no longer rely upon an external audit, that examiners get a lot stricter. We find that examiners start downgrading these ratings, CAMELS ratings, the composite, the C, A, M, and E components, whereas we find no effects for L and S. And I'll talk to you why the no effect for L and S is particularly important for our study. We also find increases in reported non-performing loans, especially those that are non-accrual. But we have no effect whatsoever for loans that are past due. We want to emphasize that this increase in non-performing loans is actually driven by well-managed banks, those banks with M ratings of 1 or 2. These are the same banks that we hypothesized that examiners might have a greater reliance strategy on. Lastly, examiners increase the length of their examinations. So we have some evidence to suggest that resource allocation is actually expanding within these regulatory agencies that are supervising these affected banks. For all the academics out there, we're going to employ this difference in difference technique. All this is suggesting is that we're going to compare that $700 million bank versus that $400 million bank after taking care of time-invariant characteristics and time-specific characteristics. And we're going to look at 3 different types of outcome variables: ratings, asset quality, and exam duration. So what we find is that CAMELS ratings increase by about 5%, meaning that they deteriorate, get closer to 5 for these affected banks after this 2005 switch. And that these trends are very consistent with the empirical identification assumptions that we need to get causal evidence over this policy change. Furthermore, we find that non-performing loans or non-accrual loans increased by about 30% after this 2005 switch. And that, again, empirically, that their trends seem consistent with our causal identification assumptions. I hope all of you at this point are getting a little suspicious. Isn't there just an easier explanation for what we're documenting? And if you totally agree with me, just space out for a minute here while I try to convince everyone else. So our story relies upon the following: that removing this mandate reduces regulatory reliance on these external ICFR audits, and that then supervisors are going to increase scrutiny. And as a result, regulators are going to downgrade ratings, they're going to force banks to recognize more bad assets on their balance sheet, and they're going to spend more time at the bank. The easier story is that removing this ICFR mandate is just going to reduce operating quality at all banks. As a result of this, managers are going to make poor decisions. As a result of that, banks' asset quality is going to deteriorate, operations are going to worsen, and as a result of that, examiners are just going to downgrade these ratings kind of mechanically. But if that alternative hypothesis were true, we would see some certain things in the data. Specifically, if this was just an operational deterioration, we'd probably see that this deterioration would manifest in all aspects of bank performance, including its L and S, or its liquidity and sensitivity to interest rate risk. And we find no effect in these components of the CAMELS rating system. And another prediction for this alternative hypothesis would be that this change would decrease banks' asset quality. And while we find this big uptick in non-accrual loans, we find no changes in loans that are 30 to 89 days past due or 90 plus days past due, indicating that this is a change in reporting rather than a change in the underlying economics of the bank. Another prediction for this alternative hypothesis is that this mandate is going to decrease operating quality, which should not be dependent upon whether or not the examiner is actually at the bank. And given the data that we were given access to, we're going to take our pre and post window and split that up. We have the specific dates that the examiners are on site at the bank. We have our post period, and we're going to create these bucket windows of time for which we know the examiners are going to be either preparing for or at the bank itself. And we're going to compare that against this non-exam window, where the examiners are not either at the bank or preparing for the exam. And if this is truly about operational deterioration, we're going to predict that there should be no difference between the exam window and the non-exam window. And we're going to look at this one specific coefficient of treat cross post cross exam. Instead, what we find is that treat cross post times exam is incredibly significant, meaning that examiners, when they're on site at the affected banks in the post period, start to increase the amount of non-accrual loans that the banks report. And this is concentrated for well-managed banks, for banks that are either 1 or 2 rated in the M category. In fact, we see the opposite results for banks that have a 3, 4, or 5 rating. So we've kind of given some suggestive evidence so far that examiners are making banks recognize more bad assets. But this is kind of contingent upon there being increased effort by these examination teams. So our channel for increased scrutiny should logically be effort. And the way that we quantify effort is looking at the duration of these bank examinations. And through the NIC data set, we have access to both the beginning date of the exam and the end date of the exam. And from that, we're just going to calculate the number of days it takes to perform an exam. In addition to the duration, we also have the type of exam. We have a full scope examination, and we have a targeted examination, and we have other idiosyncratic examinations that deal with specific regulations like BSA. And the New York Fed in their website this year talks about targeted exams a specific way, that these are exams performed on an area or risk within the firm and usually entails determining or validating that controls and processes for the target area or risk are effective. So these are the types of exams that we hypothesize are going to be the likeliest ones for which effort expands because they focus on internal controls over financial reporting rather than wholesale changes in bank operations like in a full scope exam. So what we find is that target exams actually increase for the affected banks in the post period. And the way that you should interpret this coefficient in that third column, that 6.673, suggests that the target exams for the affected banks in the post period increased by about 6.6 days relative to those same banks in the pre-period. And those no stars for the 3, 4, and 5 rated banks, these are the poorly managed banks, suggest that there's no differential change in duration for those poorly managed banks. This kind of supports our hypothesis that for those banks for which reliance was greatest in the pre-period, those are the same banks that the examiners are spending much more time on in the post-period and checking to see whether the internal control over financial reporting is actually correct. We also find that our changes in reported asset quality are concentrated in those examination windows of the target exam. So going back to a previous result on just plain old asset quality, we split that up by the examination type and we show that this is happening during those targeted exams that are likelier to focus on internal controls. We also find some results on TDRs as well. We find that our results are robust at different cuts of data. So we throw out the smallest commercial banks. We compare our affected group to the larger commercial banks, and we find fairly consistent results. We look at different types of loan portfolio composition and find that no other change in bank characteristics are happening at the same time. So just to conclude, we examine how reliance on third parties affects bank supervision. And what we find is that the decreased potential to rely on external sources actually strengthens bank supervision. And that this third-party reliance, external reliance, is an imperfect substitute for having an examiner who knows the bank, who knows knows the area and knows the geography, is the best form of supervision rather than having an audit or any other form of external assurance. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mike, and thank you all for your time.